Gridlock is the final and, in my opinion, best of Davies' New Earth trilogy, encompassing the end of the world and New Earth. The decision to focus the opening futuristic stories of the first three seasons around the same strand of future history is a very clever move, and perhaps an indication of how actually aware Davies is of the way modern television differs from television when the classic show aired. In short, it creates a pleasing sense of continuity between episodes that are very much disconnected from the show's main continuity. While it's certainly not a favourite of mine, there is plenty to discuss and unpack here. Davies did something similar in Series 1 with The Long Game and Bad Wolf, having strong time connections between the episodes. This would happen occasionally in the classic series, although not to the quite same extent. The series often had recurring villains and sequel stories. I think of Pertwee's trip to Peladon, but Tom Baker's first series in the role comes to mind, in Series 12, in that season, of link both stories between the Ark in space and Revenge of the Cybermen, unfolding on the same space station, across the series. In the old days, it was fine for the Doctor to swan off across unfamiliar features from week to week, but television has changed now. The structure of Doctor Who has changed. At the pace of a standard episode of the classic series, there was a lot more space to develop the alien planet of the week and people who inhabited it. In 90 minutes, Robert Holmes could offer the viewer a detailed sketch of alien culture, from top to bottom. This isn't just about the runtime, though. After all, a two-part adventure from the modern series can run for almost as long as a standard four-part sewer from the classic show. This is about the structure and the pace of television. Modern television doesn't really have the same time to devote to the Doctor digging into a culture, as the show carefully and meticulously introduces several characters, offering a viewpoint on how this world works. Modern television requires a much more energetic pace and a much more dynamic approach. So this creates a problem when the show has to create new worlds. It's something that Davies himself came up against when he wrote The Long Game. It's part of the reason The Doctor's Daughter stands as the weakest episode of an otherwise strong fourth season. Along with the budget, it's probably one of the reasons why the first few years of the Davies era were reluctant to stray too far from Earth. And Davies, to his credit, figured out how to make it work. He figured out that it's difficult to build an entire world in one 45-minute episode. He can develop the same world over multiple episodes. As much as The Long Game in Series 1 falters because Davies can't build anything more nuanced than a broad strokes crapsack world, Bad Wolf benefits from the fact that it's set in the wake of the future we've already visited once. As tough as it was to involve Satellite 5, the game station is nothing more than a logical step forward. So in this world of New Earth feels much more substantial in Gridlock than the concept could have been before. It's building off the back of the end of the world and New Earth, neither of which were really successful world-building stories in their own right. The end of the world quite cleverly focused on character and plot rather than building some larger society. New Earth suffered from the fact that it presented the entire planet in an existing side of a hospital. Despite the fact that Gridlock features maybe a handful of sets, including one redressed car set, a back alley and a dead Senate building, the episode feels strangely grounded and anchored in a mythology that has been subtly built and developed over the previous two series. It's quite a clever way of structuring an adventure like this, and Gridlock works a lot better than most of the series' world-building stories. It's a pretty brilliant piece of structuring, and Davies doesn't really get as much credit as he deserves for dealing with that problem. Even years later, Moffat was still struggling with that basic problem. The Rings of Akaten is probably the weakest story of the show's 50th anniversary season, and the problems are the same that Davies had with The Long Game and The Doctor's Daughter. Gridlock is built from the same fabric as The Long Game and New Earth. It's Davies using an exaggerated and hyper-stylistic, futuristic setting to take a satirical look at the modern living. In The Long Game, Davies playfully extrapolated what the modern news media might look like in the nth degree. In New Earth, Davies attacked public and private healthcare, while also throwing zombies and possession into the mix. Because everyone likes zombies and possessions. Gridlock is, on the surface, about the commute. Commuting to work has always been a part of modern living, a staple of industrialisation. Work tended to take place in cities. City living was expensive, so people tended to work outside of cities and travel into work. Throw in inflated property prices, poor public planning and transportation services, and eventually the collapse of the jobs market, and you end up with phrases like supercommuter, created to describe the 9% of the working force who commute more than 90 minutes each way, because of course, once you get there, you have to come home again. The episode takes this idea to its logical extreme. Brannigan and his wife have been travelling for over a decade to get out of somewhere that might have jobs for them. Ultimately, it turns out that everyone is just driving around in circles, creating a toxic atmosphere that threatens to suffocate anyone who dares to go outside for more than a few seconds at a time. Cars are lucky to move inches a day, and there are reports of multiple stack piles and pile-ups move into the third dimension. However, Gridlock is much more profound than that. It's a story about people, and how people tend to claim whatever small part of the world they can. The Doctor travels through a variety of cars, discovering that each one has been carefully and meticulously decorated to reflect the owner. Even in what turns out to be a post-apocalyptic wasteland, people are still holding on to their identity and originality in whatever way they can. It just oozes Davies' quality. This makes Gridlock something of a more optimistic companion piece to Davies' other futuristic third season script, Utopia. Utopia is also a story about a small cluster of survivors waiting out to the end of the world. Much like the drivers in Gridlock, those humans are surviving on the fantasy of something greater waiting beyond. The drivers here believe that the world is still turning as they commute. The survivors of the Utopia dream of a surviving paradise, but both turn out to be lies. In Utopia, the last survivors of humanity are driven mad by the nihilistic realization that there is nothing left. The Utopia itself is an illusion and a dream. As rewritten by Revelations and the Last of the Time Lords, Utopia serves as one of the bleakest scripts written by Davies, but we'll talk about that in the future. In contrast, then, Gridlock is positively optimistic about the humanity's ability to withstand the worst. The Doctor is shocked and appalled by what is going on here, and about how people continue to be trying to get on with their lives. Brannigan rejects that assertion. You think you know us so well, Doctor, but we're not abandoned, not while we have each other. While Davies makes the case that nobody seems to be trying to resolve the situation, it's made clear that humanity has given into its worst fears and anxieties. That's just brought to the forefront here. Gridlock continues quite a few of the social justice themes that run through Davies' work on Doctor Who. There's very pointedly a rigid class structure in place here. Even Brannigan identifies it as such. When the Doctor manages to track down the car carrying Martha, the two remains divided by the motorway in etiquette. Call them on this thing, he insists. We've got their number. Brannigan replies, but even if they're destined fast lane, it's a different class. What's interesting about Gridlock is that Davies seems to be making a conscious effort to tone down some of the righteous anger that powered other class-based stories like The Long Game and New Earth, and even Midnight to Come. Gridlock lacks that sort of anger, perhaps because it's more focused on the people living in the class system, rather than those actively enforcing it. Most notably, Gridlock remains remarkably sympathetic towards Brannigan, despite the character's clear conservatism. Brannigan is presented as a character worried about upsetting the apple cart, and very struck in his ways. He's actively religious, proudly participating in the hymn. Then again, so is every other driver we see. More pointedly, Brannigan refuses to acknowledge the marriage between Alice and May, referring to them as the Cassini sisters. When they correct him, he doesn't apologise. He just uses his conservatism as an excuse. I'll stop that modern talk, I'm an old-fashioned cat. Given that this is the first gay marriage portrayed in Doctor Who, even his light-hearted refusal to acknowledge is striking. In any other story, Brannigan would be a clear obstacle to the Doctor. He might even be presented as honest and well-meaning, but he could also be presented as stubborn and unreasonable. At best, he's been unconsciously enforcing the status quo. At worst, he'd be actively blocking the Doctor. Curiously, though, this episode remains sympathetic to the character throughout the runtime. When he refuses to help Martha, it's not because he's blindly loyal to the system, quite the contrary. He's smart enough not to dismiss the stories of monsters on the motorway. He doesn't want to put the lives of his family at risk, which is the most sympathetic way of possibly having him not actively help the Doctor. Similarly, he's overjoyed when the Doctor manages to free the drivers, proudly championing the Doctor's work. Did I tell you, Doctor? You're not bad, sir. You're not bad at all. However, it's to the credit of Gridlock that the issue isn't as much one-sided as Davies makes it seem. Utopia is a much stronger condemnation of how faith can poison people in the long run. In Gridlock, faith seems to keep people alive and optimistic and hopeful in the most dire of circumstances. That same faith ultimately pays off when a strange visitor from the sky arrives to solve all their problems. Indeed, Martha explicitly compares her faith in the Doctor to the driver's religious faith. But that means the only hope right now is a complete stranger, Jean protests. But that's no use. Martha is practically evangelical. It is, though, because you haven't seen the things he can do. Honestly, just trust me, both of you. You've got your faith, you've got your songs and your hymns, and I've got the Doctor. Gridlock still, however, suffers a bit from the problems associated with Martha during the third season. The Doctor's treatment of Martha feels obviously psychologically abusive at this point, repeatedly drawing attention to the fact she's only on board at his sufferance. Just one trip, the Doctor reminds her. That's what I said. One trip in the TARDIS and then home. Although I suppose I could stretch the definition. Take one trip into the past, one trip into the future. It's clear that he likes the company, but his refusal to admit this to Martha makes the relationship seem decidedly unhealthy. Something that casts a shadow over the season. Adventuring through time and space is supposed to be a wondrous experience, at least in theory. Sure, the Doctor and companions stumble across their fair share of horrors on the way, with Gridlock serving as a convenient example, but the central dynamic is the core thread that runs throughout each individual Davies series. 9 and Rose, 10 and Rose, 10 and Martha, and 10 and Donna. The strength of the dynamic contributes quite a lot to the strength of the season. The first season is quite uneven and inconsistent, watching the show figure out how to make Doctor Who again, but the relationship between Eccleston's battle-scarred Ninth Doctor and Billy Piper's shop girl Rose helps anchor it. The fourth season is a lot more confident, but even that run is elevated by the fact that David Tennant's 10th Doctor found his perfect match in Catherine Tate's Donna. Moreover, Gridlock is slightly more successful in its approach to continuity. Davies' resurrection of Doctor Who was quite careful in the way that it built up to the show's grand mythology. One of the admittedly many problems with the TV movie was the way that it assured that many people watching the show would care about Sylvester McCoy. Given how few people watched the show during the McCoy era, that was quite a miscalculation. Instead, the film was a convoluted mess designed to appeal to the hardcore fans, without seeming to understand the basic casual appeal of the show. Davies' revival was a lot shrewder. It accepted that a lot of people watching would be only casually familiar with Doctor Who, so it borrowed quite heavily from the original show without relying on audience familiarity. In particular, Davies seemed to recognise the iconography was more important than the continuity. Rose didn't feature Paul McGann, instead it features Keir Dummy's walking the street. So Davies took the time to reintroduce old concepts, rather than treating them as something belongingly inherent to the show. He reinvented the Daleks and the Cybermen, two of the most iconic villains from the show. In the third season, he pulls his most ambitious trick to date, reworking the Master in a way that makes him actually work as a character, rather than simply a convenient pantomime opponent. And Davies does this rather brilliantly. While it's easy to focus on in jokes and the arc words, the structure of the Master's return is quite elegant. The third season seems to be building towards the point where Derek Jacobi goes crazy after opening a fob watch. Feels like a satisfying dramatic payoff. So Davies has spent 2 years avoiding mentioning the name Gallifrey, so when the Doctor mentions it here, he has a great deal of weight, and it's brilliant. Gallifrey isn't used for continuity value. It wasn't a mystery, and the reluctance to use the name wasn't to create any doubt amongst fans that Davies might actually shake things up by revealing the Doctor suddenly comes from the planet Kronos. No, the point is holding back the name is so that the audience know that it's a big deal for the Doctor to even say it anymore. It serves as a character beat rather than a piece of continuity, which is where Davies' approach to Doctor Who is strongest. And that scene where it's mentioned at the end is quite excellent. Similarly, the Master's return depends on the use of a chameleon arc to hide among humanity, so Davies needs to introduce the concept of the chameleon arc. He doesn't do this by making an offhand reference by shoehorning it into an early episode, or even by inserting it into a few of the season's early entries. He has Paul Cornell adapt his book Human Nature for the show. It goes into one of the best loved episodes of the season. The chameleon arc is introduced in the service of character drama, rather than continuity. And yet there's no real way to deny Davies' affection for the show's past. He included Kronk burgers in The Long Game, for God's sake. Here he includes a shout out to a bunch of aliens from a long-lost black and white Patrick Troughton adventure. That's like a little bit of continuity that only gets included out of pure love. The fact that the macro fits so smoothly in the background of Gridlock is actually a nice touch. It's a shame they don't really impact upon the story in all honesty, but I can't complain as it's a nice nod to the classic series. There's a sense that Davies wrote the story and his inner fanboy realised that there was a bunch of aliens who do live on noxious gas in the Doctor universe, and so fit them in. It's use of continuity in a way that acknowledges the past without fetishing it too much. It's a nice, delicate balance, and something that Davies always did well during his time writing for the show, and actually is something I miss rather fondly. Also, a really nice touch for me is when the Doctor and the Face of Bone meet once more, and I specifically love the final words and the tie into Utopia with Yana or You Are Not Alone, and the Doctor's reaction to this. I must say, it's spectacular stuff from Tennant once more. Although I'm fairly full of high praise here, I do indeed have problems with this episode. While the pacing is excellent, I do believe there are certain ideas that aren't exactly given the time they deserve. For example, the mood drugs we see at the beginning of the story. While the concept is excellent, it feels like it's only introduced here to give payoff at the end of the episode, where we see the effect that they have had when once a new drug has gone disastrously wrong. I would have much preferred to see the idea given a lot more weight and time dedicated to it in all honesty. Also, I'm not particularly fond of bringing back Novice Home from New Earth. Yes, I understand this is the same time and location, and it's a nice little nod. It just seems a tad unnecessary, and really only a neat little tie-in to ensure the Doctor meets the Face of Bo once more. Also, a big nod must go to composer Murray Gold once more with a fabulous score, and one of the most memorable for me personally. Especially as it's the debut of my favourite track, The Strange Strange Creatures, and it's displayed at full capacity here during the escape sequence, and man is it fantastic. Hats off to Gold, this is where he takes it up a notch for me, and some of his very best work starts to come to the forefront from here on in.
Well, that's no use. It is, though, because you haven't seen the things that he can do. Honestly, just trust me, both of you. You've got your faith, you've got your songs and your hymns, and I've got the Doctor.
Systems back online.
Good luck.
And you.
Car 465 Diamond 6 is still registers. That's Martha.
I knew she was good.
Novice Hain, hold that in place. Take residual energy, invert it, feed it through the electricity.
But there isn't enough power.
Oh, you got power! You got me! I'm brilliant with computers, just you watch. Hain, every switch on that bank up to maximum. all the city needs is people.
So what are you going to do?
This! No, 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 no! Transformers are blocked. Signal can't get through.
Doctor,
Yeah, hold on, not now.
I give you my last.
Hey, look after him! Don't you go dying on me, you big old face! You gotta see this. The open road. Ha!
Overall, Gridlock is a tremendous piece of television and a fabulous piece of Doctor Who. It's a smart and clever script, one well handled and beautifully put together, although it does have its problems. It's a testament to how well Davies and his team have come to understand the art of Doctor Who over the previous few years. Although it's not one of the best, it's certainly very enjoyable, and it does make a lot of work towards the payoff at the end of the season. I give Gridlock a 7 out of 10.